November 8, 1519. The Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés and his small army of conquistadors stand at the edge of the Valley of Mexico, gazing down at Tenochtitlan, capital of the Aztec Empire. The city rises from the middle of a vast lake, connected to shore by causeways stretching for miles. Pyramids tower above neighborhoods. Canals crisscross the city like Venice. Markets bustle with tens of thousands of people. The city holds 200,000 inhabitants, larger than any European city except perhaps Paris. One conquistador, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, will later write, "We were amazed and said it was like the enchantments they tell of in the legend. Some of our soldiers even asked whether the things that we saw were not a dream." This is the story of how Europeans encountered the sophisticated civilizations of the Americas, societies that had developed agriculture, architecture, mathematics, astronomy, writing, and complex political systems independently of the Old World. It's the story of the Maya, Aztec, and Inca empires that rivaled any in Europe or Asia, but also of hundreds of other cultures from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego. It's a story of breathtaking achievement and tragic destruction, of worlds colliding with devastating consequences, and of a history only now being fully understood and appreciated. The term discovery is itself problematic. You cannot discover lands where millions already live. For indigenous peoples, there was no discovery. They had been here for over 15,000 years. From their perspective, Europeans were the discovered, not the discoverers. But for Europeans, encountering these civilizations was genuinely shocking. Medieval European worldview had no place for advanced civilizations unknown to the Bible or classical texts. The Americas weren't supposed to exist, and certainly not with cities, agriculture, and empires. The first peoples arrived in the Americas at least 15,000 years ago, possibly much earlier. They crossed from Siberia to Alaska via the Bering Land Bridge during the Ice Age when sea levels were lower. Others may have arrived by boat along the Pacific coast. These were not primitive savages, but sophisticated hunter-gatherers with complex technologies and social organization. As the Ice Age ended and glaciers retreated, people spread throughout the continents. They encountered and hunted megafauna, mammoths, giant sloths, enormous beavers. These animals went extinct around 10,000 BCE, either from hunting, climate change, or both. Humans adapted, developing new subsistence strategies. Agriculture emerged independently in the Americas around 8,500 BCE. In Mesoamerica, people domesticated maize, corn, beans, squash, tomatoes, and chili peppers, the agricultural package that would sustain civilizations. In South America, potatoes, quinoa, and other crops were domesticated. In North America's eastern woodlands, people cultivated squash, sunflowers, and indigenous grains. These agricultural revolutions were as significant as those in the Fertile Crescent or China, enabling population growth and settled societies. The Olmec civilization, emerging around 1500 BCE in southern Mexico, was Mesoamerica's mother culture. They built ceremonial centers with massive stone heads weighing up to 50 tons, carved from basalt transported from distant quarries. They developed early writing, a calendar system, and the ritual ball game that would spread throughout Mesoamerica. The Olmecs influenced all subsequent Mesoamerican civilizations. The Maya civilization, flourishing from roughly 200–5900 CE in southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, reached extraordinary heights. They built cities deep in rainforests, Tikal, Palenque, Capan, Calakmul. These weren't primitive villages but sophisticated urban centers with populations in the tens of thousands. Towering pyramids dominated plazas surrounded by palaces, ball courts, and residential complexes. Maya achievements were remarkable. They developed the most sophisticated writing system in the pre-Columbian Americas, a script with hundreds of hieroglyphic symbols representing syllables and words. They recorded history, mythology, astronomical observations, and royal genealogies on stone monuments and in bark paper books called codices. Spanish priests later burned nearly all Maya books, destroying irreplaceable knowledge. Only 4 codices survived. Maya mathematics was advanced. They independently invented the concept of zero, a profound mathematical achievement that didn't exist in Europe at the same time. They used a vigesimal base 20 number system. Their astronomical observations were incredibly precise. They calculated the solar year to 365.242 days, more accurate than the Julian calendar Europeans used in 1492. They predicted eclipses and tracked Venus with extraordinary accuracy. The Maya calendar was actually multiple interlocking calendars. The 260-day sacred calendar combined with a 365-day solar calendar to create a 52-year calendar round. The long count tracked days from a mythological creation date in 3114 BCE. The famous 2012 apocalypse was simply the end of one long count cycle, like an odometer rolling over, significant but not catastrophic. Maya society was hierarchical. Divine kings ruled city-states, claiming descent from gods. Nobles, priests, and warriors formed the elite. Commoners were farmers, craftsmen, and laborers. Warfare between city-states was constant for captives, tribute, and glory. Captives faced ritual sacrifice or slavery. The ritual ball game, played in special courts, had religious significance and sometimes political consequences, with losing teams sacrificed. Around 900 CE, the classic Maya civilization collapsed in the southern lowlands. Cities were abandoned. The population crashed. Why? Theories include drought, warfare, ecological degradation, or combinations thereof. Maya didn't disappear. They shifted to northern Yucatan and continued building cities like Chichen Itza. Millions of Maya descendants live today in Mexico and Central America. In central Mexico, the city of Teotihuacan dominated from roughly 105 CE. At its peak, 125,020,000 people lived there, one of the world's largest cities. The Pyramid of the Sun, built around 200 CE, rises 216 feet and contains 2.5 million tons of stone and earth. The city was planned on a grid, with broad avenues, apartment compounds, and a massive marketplace. Murals decorated buildings with vivid scenes of gods, rituals, and daily life. Teotihuacan's influence spread across Mesoamerica through trade and probably military conquest. Then, around 550 CE, the city was deliberately burned and abandoned. Who did this and why remains mysterious. Some evidence suggests internal uprising, others point to external invasion. After Teotihuacan's fall, the Toltec civilization emerged, centered at Tula. They influenced the Maya revival in Yucatan. Then came the Aztecs, or Mexica, as they called themselves. The Aztec Empire, properly the Triple Alliance of Mexico, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, dominated central Mexico from roughly 1428 to 1521. The Mexica arrived in the Valley of Mexico as migrant warriors in the 13th century, settling on a marshy island where, according to legend, they saw an eagle perched on a cactus devouring a serpent, a sign from their god Huitzilopochtli. They founded Tenochtitlan in 1325. Through military prowess and strategic alliances, the Mexica rose to dominance. By the early 1500s, their empire controlled much of central and southern Mexico, extracting tribute from conquered peoples. The empire wasn't a unified state but a network of tributaries. Conquered cities kept local rulers but sent wealth to Tenochtitlan: gold, feathers, cacao, textiles, and victims for sacrifice. Tenochtitlan was an engineering marvel. Built on an island and reclaimed marshland, the city featured chinampas, artificial agricultural islands built by piling lake-bottom mud. These floating gardens were incredibly productive, supporting the city's large population. Causeways connected the island to shore. Aqueducts brought fresh water from springs. A dike system controlled flooding. The city was clean. Waste was collected and used as fertilizer, and Tenochtitlan had public latrines, something most European cities lacked. The central precinct contained the Templo Mayor, a massive twin pyramid dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. Surrounding it were palaces, temples, schools, and the emperor's zoo and botanical garden. Markets, like the one at Tlatelolco, served tens of thousands daily. Specialized merchants traveled throughout the empire and beyond, trading goods and gathering intelligence. Aztec society was stratified. The emperor, or Tlatoni, ruled with absolute power. Below him were nobles, warriors, priests, and administrators. Commoners were organized into calpuli, kinship groups that held land communally, paid tribute, and provided military service. At the bottom were slaves, often war captives or debtors. Human sacrifice was central to Aztec religion. They believed the sun god needed human blood to rise each day. Victims, usually war captives, were sacrificed atop pyramids, their hearts removed while still beating. Spanish conquistadors claimed tens of thousands were sacrificed annually. Modern historians question these numbers as exaggerations justifying conquest, but human sacrifice definitely occurred on a significant scale. Archaeological evidence, racks of skulls, mass burials confirms this. The scale of sacrifice shocked Europeans, but context matters. Medieval Europe had its own spectacular violence, torture, burning heretics, brutal executions. Different cultures express violence differently. Aztec sacrifice was religious ritual, not sadism. Victims often went willingly, believing they gained honor and assured afterlife. This doesn't justify it, but it complicates simple narratives of barbarism. In South America, the Inca Empire dominated the Andes. Called Tawantinsuyu, land of the four quarters, it stretched from southern Colombia through Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, northern Chile, and northwestern Argentina. At its peak in the early 1500s, it covered 2 million square kilometers with perhaps 10–12 million subjects, the largest pre-Columbian empire in the Americas. The Inca Empire emerged in the 15th century from the Cusco region. Under Emperor Pachacuti, 1438–1471, and his successors, the Inca rapidly conquered neighbors, creating an empire that rivaled Rome's. The Inca military was effective, but they also incorporated conquered peoples through gifts, marriages, and infrastructure investment. The empire was multi-ethnic, with Quechua as the administrative language but local languages persisting. Inca achievements were extraordinary. They built over 25,000 miles of roads, paved highways running through mountains, deserts, and jungles. These roads, with rest stations every day's travel, facilitated communication, trade, and military movement. Rope bridges spanning gorges demonstrated engineering prowess. The Inca infrastructure was superior to contemporary European roads. Machu Picchu, built around 1450 at 8,000 feet in the Andes, exemplifies Inca architecture. Built without metal tools, mortar, or wheels, its precisely fitted stones have survived 5 centuries and countless earthquakes. The site's purpose remains debated: royal estate, religious center, or astronomical observatory. Abandoned around 1572 and hidden by jungle, it remained unknown to outsiders until Hiram Bingham's 1911 expedition. The Inca didn't have writing as we understand it, but they had quipu, knotted strings used for record keeping. Different colored strings, knot types, and positions encoded numerical and possibly narrative information. Quipucamiocs, specialists in reading quipu, track tributes, census data, and possibly historical accounts. Most quipu were destroyed, and the decoding system was lost. Modern scholars are only beginning to understand them. Inca society was highly organized. The emperor, or Sapa Inca, was considered divine, descended from the sun god Inti. The nobility provided administrators and military commanders. Commoners were organized into ilas, kinship groups that held land communally. The Mita system required labor service, building roads, mining, or military service. In return, the state redistributed resources, maintained storehouses for famine relief, and provided security. Religion permeated life. The Inca worshipped many gods: Inti the sun god, Viracocha the creator, Mamaquilla the moon goddess, and earth mountain deities. Human sacrifice occurred but less frequently than among the Aztecs. The most significant sacrifices were Capacacha, ritually sacrificed children sent to mountain peaks. Archaeological discoveries of frozen child mummies reveal this practice's reality and the reverence with which victims were treated. North America beyond Mexico had equally sophisticated societies, though different in structure. The Mississippian culture, flourishing roughly 800–1600 CE in the Mississippi River Valley and southeast, built large towns and ceremonial centers. Cahokia, near modern St. Louis, was North America's largest pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico. At its peak around 1100 CE, perhaps 10,020 people lived there, with another 20,030 in surrounding areas. Monk's Mound, Cahokia's central earthwork, is larger at its base than Egypt's Great Pyramid. Cahokia was a political and religious center with stratified society, monumental architecture, long-distance trade networks, and specialized craftsmen. Then, around 1350 CE, it declined and was abandoned. Climate change, warfare, political instability, the reasons remain debated. In the southwest, the ancestral Pueblones, formerly called Anasazi, built remarkable cliff dwellings like those at Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon. Chaco Canyon, in New Mexico, was a ceremonial and trade center from roughly 851–150 CE. Its great houses were multi-story stone buildings with hundreds of rooms. Roads radiated from Chaco to outlying communities. The society was sophisticated, with astronomical observations, elaborate ceremonies, and extensive trade networks bringing seashells, macaw feathers, and copper from distant regions. Around 1150 CE, Chaco was abandoned, possibly due to drought, deforestation, or social upheaval. The ancestral Pueblones migrated, becoming ancestors of modern Pueblo peoples like the Hopi and Zuni. The Iroquois Confederacy in the Northeast demonstrated sophisticated political organization. 5 nations, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, formed a democratic confederacy possibly as early as 1142 CE, though dates are disputed. The Great Law of Peace established governance by consensus, with clan mothers selecting male chiefs and retaining the power to remove them. Benjamin Franklin and other founding fathers studied the Iroquois system when designing American democracy. In the Pacific Northwest, societies like the Tlingit, Haida, and Kwakwaka'wakwa developed complex cultures based on abundant salmon fisheries. They built impressive plank houses, carved monumental totem poles, and held potlatch ceremonies, massive gift-giving feasts demonstrating wealth and status. These were non-agricultural societies, yet highly stratified and culturally sophisticated. The Plains peoples, Lakota, Cheyenne, Comanche, and others, developed distinctive horse-based nomadic cultures, but only after Europeans introduced horses in the 1500s. Before that, they were hunter-gatherers and small-scale farmers. The classic Plains Indian culture actually lasted only about 150 years before being destroyed by American expansion. When Europeans arrived in 1492, they encountered a hemisphere with perhaps 5,100 million inhabitants. Estimates vary widely. Hundreds of distinct cultures spoke thousands of languages. Political organizations ranged from small bands to vast empires. Subsistence strategies included hunting-gathering, fishing, agriculture, and combinations thereof. Spirituality was diverse, animistic, polytheistic, ancestor-worshipping traditions. Europeans, arriving with guns, steel, horses, and devastating diseases, had decisive advantages, but indigenous resistance was fierce and often successful. The Aztec Empire fell quickly, 1519–1521, but only because Cortés exploited internal divisions. Subjugated peoples, especially the Tlaxcalans, allied with Cortés against their Aztec overlords. Tenochtitlan fell after a brutal siege, with thousands of indigenous allies doing most of the fighting. The Inca Empire also fell rapidly, 1532–1572, but again, civil war weakened it. Emperor Huayna Capac died from European diseases, probably smallpox, that spread ahead of Spanish arrival. His sons Atahualpa and Huascar fought a civil war for succession. Francisco Pizarro arrived during this chaos with just 168 men. At Cajamarca in 1532, Pizarro ambushed and captured Atahualpa, then executed him despite receiving an enormous ransom. The empire fragmented, though resistance continued for decades. Disease was the decisive factor in European conquest. Indigenous Americans had no immunity to Eurasian diseases: smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza. These epidemics killed 90% or more of the indigenous population within a century of contact. Entire societies collapsed. Survivors were traumatized, demoralized, and unable to resist effectively. European conquest succeeded largely because of biological warfare they didn't even intend. The diseases did most of the killing. The demographic catastrophe was staggering. Mexico's population, perhaps 20–25 million in 1519, dropped to about 1 million by 1600. Peru's population similarly crashed. In North America, diseases often preceded European explorers, devastating societies before direct contact. When pilgrims arrived at Plymouth in 1620, they found cleared land and abandoned villages. A recent epidemic had killed most inhabitants. This demographic collapse remains contentious. Some scholars argue diseases alone caused it. Others emphasize violence, enslavement, forced labor, and social disruption. The encomienda system, granting Spanish colonists indigenous labor, was essentially slavery. Millions died in mines and plantations. The conquest wasn't just biological but also military, economic, and cultural. Spanish conquistadors systematically destroyed indigenous cultural heritage. Diego de Landa, Bishop of Yucatan, burned Maya codices in 1562, declaring, "We found a large number of books, and as they contain nothing in which were not to be seen as superstition and lies of the devil, we burned them all." Similar destruction occurred everywhere. Temples were demolished, often with stones used to build churches atop the foundations, a symbolic and literal erasure. Yet indigenous cultures survived. People hid sacred objects, practiced traditional religions in secret, maintained languages, and preserved oral traditions. Mestizaje, mixing of European and indigenous peoples, created new identities. Today, tens of millions of people in the Americas identify as indigenous or of indigenous descent. Languages like Quechua, Nahuatl, and Maya languages still have millions of speakers. Rediscovery of indigenous civilizations happened gradually. Spanish chronicles described Aztec and Inca societies, though filtered through European biases. Colonial-era mestizo writers like Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala, Peru, and Fernando de Alva Ixtlahuaxochitl, Mexico, documented indigenous histories from inside perspectives. But systematic archaeology came later. In the 19th century, explorers like John Lloyd Stephens and Frederick Catherwood documented Maya ruins, sparking fascination with lost civilizations. Hiram Bingham's 1911 discovery of Machu Picchu captured global imagination, though locals always knew it existed. 20th century archaeology revolutionized understanding. Decipherment of Maya hieroglyphs in the 1950s–80s revealed Maya history wasn't just mythology but detailed records of real dynastic politics. LiDAR technology, using laser scanning from aircraft, recently discovered thousands of previously unknown Maya structures hidden by jungle. Indigenous perspectives are increasingly centered. For too long, indigenous history was written by outsiders. Now, indigenous scholars, activists, and communities are reclaiming their histories, challenging colonial narratives, and asserting continuing cultural identity. The past isn't dead. It's living in indigenous communities maintaining traditions despite centuries of oppression. Modern understanding recognizes indigenous Americans' achievements. Domesticating maize from teosinte was a genetic engineering feat requiring centuries of selective breeding. The crop diversity developed in the Americas, thousands of potato varieties, countless maize types, represents agricultural knowledge accumulated over millennia. About 60% of crops grown globally today originated in the Americas. Indigenous environmental knowledge was sophisticated. Controlled burning maintained ecosystems. Agricultural practices like the Three Sisters, maize, beans, squash demonstrated ecological wisdom. Each crop benefited the others. The Amazon rainforest, long thought pristine wilderness, is now understood as shaped by thousands of years of indigenous management. The untouched wilderness Europeans claimed to find was actually managed landscape. Indigenous political systems influenced modern democracy. The Iroquois Confederacy's federal structure and democratic practices impressed colonial Americans. Whether it directly influenced the U.S. Constitution is debated, but connections existed. Concepts of liberty, equality, and governance by consent weren't purely European imports. The artistic achievements, Maya murals, Aztec sculpture, Inca textiles, Northwest Coast totem poles, are recognized as world-class art. Museums worldwide display these works, though provenance issues and repatriation debates continue. The tragedy is what was lost. Imagine if 90% of Europeans had died in the 14th century, if most books had been burned, if knowledge systems had been deliberately destroyed. That's what happened in the Americas. We're left with fragments, ruins, artifacts, some texts, oral traditions, trying to reconstruct sophisticated civilizations largely erased. Yet indigenous peoples survived and persist. In Bolivia, the president is indigenous. In Mexico, millions speak indigenous languages. In Peru, Quechua is official. In North America, tribal sovereignty is legally recognized. Indigenous movements demand land rights, cultural preservation, and political representation. The story of discovering America's indigenous civilizations is really a story of loss and recovery, loss of lives, cultures, and knowledge through conquest and disease, and slow recovery of understanding, appreciation, and respect. It's about recognizing that the Americas weren't an empty wilderness, but homelands of millions of people with sophisticated societies. It's about acknowledging that European civilization came to the Americas not as a gift, but as a catastrophe. From the Olmec stone heads to Tenochtitlan's causeways, from Maya astronomical observatories to Inca rope bridges, from Cahokia's mounds to Iroquois democratic councils, indigenous Americans created civilizations as impressive as any in the world. They developed agriculture independently, built cities, created art and architecture, made mathematical and astronomical discoveries, and organized complex societies. When Cortés gazed at Tenochtitlan in 1519, he wasn't seeing a primitive village but a sophisticated capital that would have been impressive in Europe or Asia. When conquistadors encountered Inca roads and engineering, they were experiencing infrastructure superior to contemporary Europe's. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, they didn't find a new world but very old worlds, with histories, achievements, and complexities Europeans couldn't initially comprehend. The discovery of America's indigenous civilizations isn't a historical event finished in 1492. It's an ongoing process. Archaeological discoveries revealing new sites, linguistic analyses recovering lost languages, indigenous communities sharing knowledge, scholars challenging colonial narratives. Every year brings new understanding of what existed before contact and what survived after. The story ends not with conquest but with persistence. Despite genocide, disease, oppression, and erasure, indigenous peoples and cultures survive. Their achievements are being recognized, their histories told more accurately, their descendants asserting rightful place in societies built on their ancestors' lands. The civilizations Cortés saw as a dream weren't enchantments but real societies built by real people, societies that deserve to be remembered, understood, and honored.